Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for welcoming me. Thanks especially to Bishop Viv. It is amazing, isn't it, when paths cross after a couple of decades, and to find people again and discover the ways that God has led us in different ways. So it's a real joy to be here in Bristol, as it were. Bristol was also our home for a number of years when I was at Trinity College teaching there. I'm particularly sorry not to be present physically with you in beautiful Bristol. So thank you. What I'd like to do, as Chris has said, we're going to be having a little bit later on some tasters of Living in Love and Faith, just to give you an idea of what it might be like to participate in a Living in Love and Faith course, or indeed to facilitate or lead one. But to begin with, I'd like to give you a brief overview of Living in Love and Faith, just in case you're not so familiar with the resources and why the church has produced them. So I'll share my screen so that you can follow a PowerPoint. So in this short presentation, what I'd like to say is, first of all, talk a little bit about why it is that the Church of England has embarked on Living in Love and Faith in the first place. And then just to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of all the resources that are available, just in case you haven't had a chance to explore those for yourself yet. And then say a little bit about the really important question of how we hope that people will engage with living in love and faith across the church. And later in the morning, we'll look a little bit more at the practicalities in terms of the trajectory of living in love and faith in the life of the church, but then locally, what next for you in Bristol Diocese. So beginning with why. Questions of sexuality, marriage, relationships have been pondered on by the Church of England, for many decades. So it is a good question to ask, why are we doing Living in Love and Faith now after all these years of talking and quite often debating these questions? Well, there have been many statements and guidances written about these questions, and perhaps the most recent initiative were the shared conversations, and maybe some of you were part of those shared conversations across the church, which took place over nearly 3 years, I think. And it was on the back of those shared conversations that the bishops then wrote a report, which they took as a kind of formality to General Synod in February 2017, requesting Synod to take note of the report. Well, albeit by a narrow margin, Synod chose not even to take note of the report. And that felt like quite a shock. It was a bit of a crisis, really, but I do believe that it was a crisis that has borne fruit in the shape of living in love and faith, because it was on the back of that quite quickly the archbishops and the bishops recognized that we need to take a new approach. The way we've been tackling, debating these questions over decades simply has not worked, has not taken us further. And so they launched what was then called an Episcopal teaching document. And one of the aspirations of that Episcopal teaching document was to engage with the whole church. So when over 40 people were invited to take part to make this happen, very diverse people with different expertise, different lived experiences, different convictions, were gathered together to do this work, one of the first things they did was to change the name. So we called it Living in Love and Faith, Christian Teaching and Learning about Identity, Sexuality, Relationships, and Marriage. Perhaps a little bit easier to understand than Episcopal teaching document. Well, what was going to be distinctive about this that was different from the church's many efforts in previous decades? I think there are 3 areas in which it would be distinctive. One was that we wanted to set the very specific questions about which we frankly do have deep disagreements, to put those in the much bigger framework of our understanding as Christians of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? What does it mean to be redeemed? And so on. So really, we wanted to set questions that we had perhaps been chewing over together into this much bigger perspective, and recognizing that there's a lot of deep learning for all of us to do. So it is about learning. It's about learning that there are sort of new truths, deeper truths that we have to explore together in relation to these things, also in the light of what's happening in the world around us. And this learning is to be for the whole church. It's not some learning that a small enclave of bishops does and then hands down as teaching to the whole church. It is for everyone to learn. We all have depths of learning to do about being human, but yes, of course, therefore, about who God is and who we are in relation to God and his love for us. So 3 distinctives, and the 40 or so people who were then called upon to try and work those distinctives into a suite of resources really had in their minds a number of things, a number of ways in which they wanted to embed those distinctives. First of all, they wanted to make sure that the resources, whatever they were, invited people onto a learning journey. So it is about learning together. And secondly, if we're looking at questions of what does it mean to be human, then yes, of course, we reach for scripture first and foremost, so that we explore what it is the Bible has to tell us, the deepest truths about being human. But there are other disciplines, the social sciences, the biological sciences, history, and so on, which also are seeking truth about our understanding what it means to be human. And so we wanted to have a multidisciplinary exploration, and especially to connect what other disciplines, to connect those with our Christian understanding. If it's about being human, then this is about every single one of us. It's not about a particular group of people. It's about every single one of us. And so we wanted to remember all the way through that these truths that we're exploring together relate to the reality of each of our lives and each of our stories. And so we wanted to embed that in all the resources. And finally, I did say that we have disagreements about some of these questions. We have a lot of common ground, but we have some disagreements. And the group that was brought together, those disagreements were embodied in that group. And there was a real determination to present the different perspectives that are held as fairly and as thoroughly and as positively as possible, and not in any sense to have to sway the material in one direction or another. It's up to you to decide whether or not we were successful, but that was the absolute intention of the group that put those resources together. So what are these resources? Well, I guess at the heart of the resources is the Living in Love and Faith book. It is a substantial book, over 400 pages, but I would argue that it is actually quite an accessible book, and it does genuinely invite the reader on a learning journey, a journey that you can pick up at different points in the book, depending on your particular interest, perhaps. The book is accompanied by a number of podcasts, and these are conversations among the many contributors to the book, which was collaboratively written. And they take some of the chapters in the book and discuss them further and disagree about some of the conclusions they draw. And we hope that models something of what we hope will happen across the church. But if this is about engaging everyone across the church in learning together as far as possible, then clearly not many people will engage with a 400-page book. And so the Living in Love and Faith course is a really important means of enabling people to engage with these questions together. And so we have the course, which is available in video form, as well as a booklet, and I'll say a bit more in a moment. We also have a number of films of lived experience stories, again, just to keep reminding us that these are about our real lives. They're deeply personal. And also they enable us, hopefully, to encounter perhaps people we might not otherwise have encountered. Behind all this, there's a suite of resources. Some of those have been written specially by the Living in Love and Faith, members of the Living in Love and Faith group, but a whole host of other resources, scholarly articles on different disciplines, autobiographies, all sorts, for if you want to take a particular view or a particular topic further. All of those are available on the Living in Love and Faith Hub. And I hope that you will register on the Hub through the Church of England website, churchofengland.org/LLF, and it invites you to register on the Hub with your email address. And that's partly just to signal that you are not just entering a website to surf and look for the things that you want to see, but to take you on a learning journey yourself. I'd just like to say a few things more about the book and the course because they are so central to the resources. We're now in May 2021, and it was in March 2020 that the House of Bishops met for the last time physically. And it was at that meeting that they had the final draft of the book in their hands, and having journeyed with the LLF team over those 3 years, they unanimously commended the resources to the whole church. And so the book begins and ends with words from the bishops to the Church of England, to all of us, an invitation to engage and an appeal to contribute to the church's process of discerning a way forward for us all. It then takes us on a learning journey, reflecting initially on what have we received through scripture, through the tradition of the church, in relation to our understanding about these things. Having looked inward, it then takes a look outward at the world around us. A lot is happening in our society in relation to questions of identity, sexuality, relationships, and marriage. So we look out at society, we look out at what's happening in the sciences, we look at what's happening in other faith communities. Having done that, we try and make connections with where we are, 21st century England, and where we are in God's big story as told in the scriptures and the tradition of the church. So the third part is really at the heart of it, trying to understand these questions in the light of our place in God's story. But having done all that, we nevertheless come to some different conclusions about particular questions. And so part 4 explores, as it were, the roots of our differences by asking the question of how is it that we hear God? First and foremost, I guess, through scripture, inspired by the Spirit, as we will celebrate tomorrow. So there's a big section on scripture, but we hear God also through the natural world. We hear God through culture, through prayer, through our consciences, and so on. And part 5 is a little bit like the podcasts. They're conversations, in a way demonstrating and exploring how we can use what we have learned to explore more deeply our convictions about these important matters. And in between, so important, are little vignettes in between each part, almost to cause us to pause on our journey of learning and to meet real people, real lives, real stories. Again, maybe sometimes of people we might not otherwise have met. And so the course, let me just say a few words about the course. It's a course that is first and foremost intended for groups. And that's such an important part of the Living in Love and Faith vision, that we engage together in this learning and hopefully together across our different convictions and lived experiences. The course is available in video form. There are 5 videos because it's in 5 parts, but structured quite differently from the book, much more thematically. So we begin by reflecting on what it means to learn together as disciples of Jesus about these very personal and important questions. And then it takes the 3 core topics, as it were, of identity, relationships, and sex, before in the 5th chapter, inviting all of us to reflect on what then does it mean for our life together as a church with this diversity and difference that we find among ourselves. Each of the sessions in the course has a number of different components. They begin with a reflection on one or more of the pastoral principles. A bit more about that in a moment. And then there are 2 teaching sessions. And those teaching sessions are kind of a distillation of what's in the book in relation to that particular topic. And there's a Bible study. And these are all interactive, inviting people to discuss and reflect together. And there's an invitation for prayer and reflecting on our learning together. And importantly, the video version of the course has some of those story films embedded in them. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of the resources. And if you haven't yet, I do hope you will register on the hub and explore them further. But as Bishop Viv has already so helpfully reminded us, these questions of identity, sexuality, relationships, marriage are deeply personal. And so how we go about doing this is absolutely vital. We have a vision, I guess, that as we engage with each other relating to these matters, that we will create spaces for enabling us to learn together well. We're describing those spaces as spaces that are braver and safer than perhaps they have been before. There is no question that as a church, we have not done that well in the past. We have hurt people, we have offended people, we have damaged people, we have even excluded people. And this must not be so. And so we've described it as braver and safer. Why braver? Any learning is about stretching our understanding, broadening our horizon, being prepared to consider new understanding, new perspectives, new convictions, new experiences, perhaps. And in order to do that, we need to be prepared to be transformed by that learning. And that takes courage. And so we realize that in order to do this, we do need to have some bravery. But absolutely, we must feel safe as we do that. Otherwise, there is no way that we will learn together. We need to be safe enough to ask questions, safe enough to share our own convictions, safe enough to share our own lived experiences without being afraid of being rejected, of being judged, of being excluded or offended in any way. So our deep hope is that as a people of God, we will learn to create these braver and safer spaces. Some time ago, the church produced the pastoral principles. And what these are about recognizing that within each of us, there are obstacles to learning together well, obstacles to our learning together in love and faith, the obstacles of prejudice, of unhelpful silence, ignorance, fear, hypocrisy, and misuse of power. And that's why these are embedded in the Living in Love and Faith course, so that we examine ourselves first and foremost and try and remove some of those obstacles. But the course itself invites people who participate in a group to make some commitments about how we relate to each other in our working and learning together. And those are on the videos as well. There are lots of notes for leaders for each of the sessions, as well as for the course as a whole. And there is some quite specific, lengthy guidance about how what braver and safer conversations look like in relation specifically to these topics. What are things that are out of bounds, and how can we help manage and help people to understand that? So that's really important. And we're providing training for facilitators in case, as a leader of a group, you'd like to reflect a little bit on how you might facilitate those groups well. So, living in love and faith. It is about learning. There is deep learning for all of us to engage in relation to these subjects. But we need to do that together. We need to do that by, as Bishop Viv said, by listening deeply to each other as well as to the learning. And above all, of course, listening to the God who is present among us. And we need to do that more bravely and more safely than we have done that before. And this is actually quite a radical process for the Church of England, because it is about recognizing that God speaks, yes, through scripture, but also through the reflections of the whole people of God, and trusting the Spirit to speak through all of us, so that all of us, as we learn together, begin to discern what it is that the Spirit is saying to the church today regarding these matters, and who knows what else we might also learn along the way. So I hope that gives you a good backdrop to begin to see living in life, love and faith in that slightly bigger perspective.